Welcome to the Leesburg Public Library and the History of Memorial Day with Tom Wilcox. We're so excited to have him back. I know you are too, continuing his history series. If you have questions during the session, please use the chat feature. I'll be watching that. And he will also have time after the presentation to answer questions then. His next program is on Thursday, June 3rd, and that will be the Florida Cattle Guard. You're going to see that during the summer months, we will be focusing specifically on Florida history. And there will be other presenters as well. That has not been put out there yet, but watch your e-newsletters on Saturday. That's coming soon. So Tom's part of that will be presenting the Florida Cattle Guard, which he had to tell me what that was. So fascinating. I can't wait to learn about it. On June 3rd. That registration is open already. Tom Wilcox is a professional career librarian in many industries, including law, medical, and public librarianship. And through his love of history and his history with us of providing this kind of promotion presentations, we are thrilled to continue to have Tom as a presenter, even during his retirement. Tom, take it away.
All right, thank you, Deb. Well, pleased to be back. I enjoy doing these, and I enjoy seeing all of you and coming back to the library once a month and just say hello to everyone who I've worked with for a long time. And it's a win-win situation for me. And besides, I probably need to get out of the house more. But anyway, I wanted to let you know before we start this that I actually have a version of this on YouTube, which we had done before. And so because of that, I decided to totally redesign so you're not seeing the same thing, hearing exactly the same words. And I hope that this will, work for you. So let's start this. Right. Well, first of all, we have to define the day because there's a lot of confusion about it. And actually, there's this hashtag at the bottom called Know the Difference. It's an actual organization. And so they define Veterans Day, and that's to anyone who served, honor anyone who served in the military or is still living. Like, for instance, my cousin Tom is a veteran. He's living, and, that would fit for him. Whereas Memorial Day is actually for those who have actually died while serving in the military. And it doesn't actually have to be exactly in battle. Okay, well, all right, it doesn't have to be in battle. It really could be anything. And just to give you an idea of it, there's this 19th century cemetery in my hometown in Brooklyn, New York, called Greenwood Cemetery. And it was established quite a few years, like 18 years before the Civil War even started. And so it was the fitting place to have a memorial to the first Brooklyn native, and Brooklyn was still a separate city in those days, who died in service to his country. And it actually happened to be a 10-year-old boy who died in camp of disease, which was all too common then. And he has a very fine, impressive memorial there. And they do give tours, and a lot of famous people in New York and American history are there, and it's a beautiful cemetery. In its early years, it was actually used as a park by people, which actually prompted them to design a park nearby called Prospect Park. So anyway, that is the difference between the 2 days. These are some of the things we do. We have parades, we have barbecues, weekend sales, lots of weekend sales. And I'm sure last year, everyone gave it a workout on their computers. This particular parade is noteworthy because this was actually done in Carlisle, Pennsylvania last year, May 30th, 2020. And that was an enormous leap of faith about this. And we'll get to that in a moment, because it was a lot of things. And we actually faced this ourselves because, like, for instance, Bike Week, I mean, we didn't do it last year. I'm not even sure we're going to do it this year. I haven't heard one way or the other, but you see the quandary this was causing. Now, it is a really important ceremony that became part of the day. This is the president laying a memorial wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. And I was originally going to use a stock photograph from whitehouse.gov of President Trump doing this last year, because as we know, it hasn't happened yet. So President Biden, there are no pictures of President Biden doing it. And I chose this one because it was in the Library of Congress site. And this is so early that most of the monument that we know, the tall standing square part, is not yet there. And actually, I don't believe the president is even actually there. And yet they were laying the wreath. So it must have been really, really important enough. And then later on, I believe by 1931, the tomb that we know is intact. But I just thought this was a great, great photo. And anyway, if you're not sure why it's there, it holds the remains of unknown Americans who perished in battle in the First World War to the Vietnam War. And actually, the last internment for Vietnam actually had to be removed because with advances in DNA technology in 1998, and this was still fairly early on for DNA, they were able to identify his remains, and he was turned over to his family and reburied with his actual name on his stone and birth and death date, his service, where he served, and all that stuff. So it's right now it's still sort of vacant, but they will get there. I tried to see if they had any plans for the two Gulf Wars and the Iraqi War, Afghanistan, all those things, but I don't think a decision has actually been made yet. So we're just going to have to wait on that. Now, of course, this became so much a part of Memorial Day that it actually sort of had a spin-off. And Wreaths Across America, which is usually in December, and we've done it here in Lonoke. Santa, you probably remember that. And they take donations. It's a private organization, and they place wreaths on military headstones. And we've done this in Lonoke. And but I think the whole idea basically came from the Memorial Day observances, because they've been doing it for so long, at least since 1921, when the monument was originally built. Now, the day is sort of redefining itself, and there are a lot of different reasons why. One of the public interest is lessening, funding is lessening, and of course lately, COVID-19, social distancing guidelines, masking, all this restrictions, and this is contemporary from this year, this May. This newspaper has Rehoboth Beach in Delaware. They decided to cancel their parade, and I'm sure hundreds of counties and towns have done exactly that. And it's very, very sad, and it certainly doesn't bode well for continued observance. But it's one of those things that nobody really wants to stop doing it, and yet there seems to be this inertia that's sort of heading that way in some ways. And here's one of the reasons why today is in trouble aside from COVID. We have TV, we have movies, streaming video, music on smartphones. I mean, in a way, Memorial Day was a form public entertainment. I mean, there would be these huge parades, large ceremonies with speakers, and we're not the same people as we once were. Like, for instance, at the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln spent about 2.5 minutes giving a speech after a 2-hour oration by Edward Everett. and that's what people in the 19th century were used to. And we have just too much competition. People don't have the patience or the attention span to sit and stand around for all of that. So it can be a real issue. Now, there are signs of renewal. You know, like I said, people are not ready to quite give up on this. And this parade, Merton in Pennsylvania, they are having their parade, as you see, 5/31/21, and they're going ahead with it, but they're keeping schedules, masking, social distancing guidelines, and a lot of things that it can be done to do this as safely as possible. So like I said, while some people canceled for safety reasons, other people put in other safety reasons, safeguards to proceed. And here's some new ideas. I always put something about my hometown, Brooklyn, and this is what I did. This is an article I found in the Brooklyn Reporter newspaper. And this is from my neighborhood, Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. And they're hosting a cars-only Memorial Day parade. So instead of marching, everybody's traveling down Shore Road in cars, and it's a good long parade route and it's good for social distancing because thanks to the City of New York and the Works Progress Administration, this park starts at 69th Street and goes to 101st Street. That's several miles. And so thanks to Jaime de Jesus, who published this May 21st, 2021, this is what they're doing, which I think is a great idea. And I think that holds out hope that people are going to try and figure out a way to do this. Now, this is another development in order to help make things safely. This is from the New York Times, and they published picnicking guidelines. They have this graphic showing how everyone can enjoy the day and everything. And of course, the CDC recommends that if you've all had both barrels of vaccination and other people have had the same, it's fairly safe to meet in groups. But I mean, there are a lot of things out there if you're not sure how to have something in public on Memorial Day. There are a lot of things out there to help you like this. Of course, there are questions. And this was published by Methodist Texas Hospital in Houston, Texas. And there are literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of newsletters. Everyone has published something. I saw things in USA Today. I saw things in the LA Times. Hospitals like Methodist have put out guidelines. So once again, if you need help trying to arrange an event for Memorial Day, there's a lot of advice out there. Okay, now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of why do we have a Memorial Day? Because, I mean, since the beginning of time, there have been inscriptions indicating great battles and people who died. And I mean, literally, probably millions of individual monuments. But we have a day, a designated day, because it was a way to deal with really the greatest trauma so far this nation has ever faced, and that's the Civil War. And let's show you why. I mean, it was just the scale of losses. This is actually the Gettysburg. It was taken by Alexander Gardner, and it's in. He was worked for Matthew Brady, and he's the one who actually did most of the legwork. And Brady was sort of the administrative guy, and but just shows you the statistic. We had almost 2 million people in 33 states and organized territories. 11 states seceded from the Union. And in the 4 years, there are an estimated 675,000 dead. I mean, we have never lost that many Americans before or since. And it was a huge number when you compare it to the population. I saw one figure, it was something like 6% of the population of the United States at that time. And we sort of know a little something about that because the latest thing I saw was that in the last year, we have lost 575,000 Americans to COVID. And it was even worse in the Spanish flu in 1918. It was something like, 250,000, which even though it's like half our present number, when you consider the population at the time, that was a lot of people. And so basically what I'm saying is that there had to be a way to actually rationalize this and make some sense out of this. And this is an example. This is a rather gruesome picture that was taken contemporary in 1865. And the Cold Harbor Battle happened in June of 1864. This is a year later. And these newly freed slaves, they were hired as workers to gather up remains on the battlefield. And this one battle alone accounted for nearly 18,000 dead. And now these workers, many of these remains were hastily buried, just lightly with sand and gravel over them. But they did try to establish, they do actually have a real cemetery there, a national cemetery. And this was a real problem in those days because there was no standard soldier ID. What we know of as dog tags didn't become standard military issue until about 1912. And with lack of identification, many soldiers relied on their wives, girlfriends, or even themselves to sew into their uniforms, their names and where they came from so that somebody would be told. And now, of course, as you see from this picture, the state of the remains make that fairly impossible. And what I heard is that basically, my research, that 1 in 5 soldiers in that conflict never returned home. And one of them was my great-great-grandfather. He actually died in 1862 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and it recorded he died in the city hospital, but there was no indication on his record of where his remains are. And there is an old cemetery in the city that is there. I think it's called Silver Lake Cemetery. And chances are he is there somewhere, but there's just no record of it. And this sort of gives you an idea of the massive scale of what everyone had to do then. And so we actually have this huge military cemetery network, and you can actually search for them on the National Park Service. And they claim that they have reburied the remains of 620,000 out of the 675 Civil War dead. And many of them are located in the Southeast near where the battles occurred, of course. And of course, Arlington is the best known. And there's actually, in a way, our most sacred national cemetery, and yet it was really sort of picked out of spite. Um, the architect of the Capitol, his name was Montgomery Meigs. He was so distraught when his only son was killed that he, very soon after, he seized the Custis Lee mansion outside of the city, and he ordered the dead to be buried there, which turned out in the long run to be a very costly decision because Robert E. Lee, of course, had the owner because it was actually his wife's plantation, but under the law at the time, he owned it. He had died in 1870, but his son, Robert Fitzhugh Lee, was very, very much alive, and he sued the federal government because he thought that it was improper seizure of the property, and he actually did win that case. The government spent quite a bit of money to reimburse him because he, of course, didn't want to live there anymore because it was surrounded by graves. So, sometimes things seem like a good idea, but actually they're not. And this is a typical stone where they couldn't ID the remains. And I mean, theoretically, you probably could get traces of DNA, possibly, and be able to go into the databanks to see if you can find possible descendants. I mean, it is possible, but that would be a hugely expensive undertaking. And I think they're just going to leave it pretty much as it is. Now, like I said, you can actually not only find a military cemetery, but the National Archives actually has a number of records, and they have 22 rolls of microfilm, and they have 166,000 card records of headstone contracts, and I've seen them. Family Search has some of them, and a few other places have some of them that have been digitized from the microfilm. And like, for instance, believe it or not, Family Search, I have one for my grandfather, who, of course, was not in the Civil War. He actually was a veteran of the First World War. And it was filled out and signed by my mother. And I was actually present when she filled that out. So it was really a lot of fun to find it. So if you believe you may actually have a Civil War ancestor who was identified, these are ways. And if anyone wants the actual web links or anything, just email Deb, and we can provide them. But it's pretty easy. If you just Google National Archives headstones, boom, it goes right in. And like I said, this was a massive task, and it was started right away. It was started while the war was still on. And the armies weren't actively fighting when things had calmed down. And Americans really, really needed to do this because to make sense of all this. And that's where we got the idea to have this dedicated Memorial Day to remember them. This is one of my favorite pictures of an early Civil War memorial because this was in 1865. This is the first Bull Run monument. And if you notice, around the pediment at the top, there are shells. And there's a funny story to this because, as you see, as I told you, it was erected in 1865. And in 1961, for the centennial of the war, the National Park Service decided to refurbish the old monuments. And this was one of them. And when they did so, they found out to their horror that these shells were alive. They had been there more than 90 years, and they could explode at any moment. And so they actually had to call out an Army Corps of Engineers demolition team to safely remove them, and so they could be replaced. So, like I said, a lot of this memorializing was done with extremely great and ill-advised taste. And This is actually one thing you'll find in Arlington. This is a monument dedicated to all the unknowns and who were buried and unidentified dead from the entire war. And that brings up sort of an important point because originally Southerners and Northerners tended to bury their own. And there was a lot of animosity, of course, we all know why. And, but, you know, because of things like Cold Harbor, after a while, it was impossible to know who was whom. And like, for instance, some Union uniforms, even though they were blue, some of them had sort of a grayish cast to them. A lot of Confederates wore brown, butternut. There was a lot of confusion. So they just had to do something. And this is a really great book if you ever want to find it. It's here in the library. Here's the code number 973.71 FAU. And it's called This Republic of Suffering, Death and the American Civil War. Do have to sort of warn you that it is sort of a dense read. It's very worthwhile, very detailed, but I think you'll learn a lot. And if you don't have time for that, we don't have it in this library, but it is in the system. It's a PBS documentary called Death and the Civil War. And I mean, it brought up a lot of surprising things. In fact, even so much a person as Clara Barton got involved because after the war, she somehow wrangled to start an office called the Office of Missing Friends. And they would field inquiries and information and try to match up people who were lost, who never got home. And, you know, in 3 years, they managed to actually identify thousands of people based on the information they had in the inquiries. So this is one of the things that the book and the video actually do cover. Okay, you know, one of the things is, you know, who started all this? And it's very competitive because we have actually 4 different towns in the United States who all say they started it. And the only consensus is it's sometime between 1862 and 1866. And the jury's still out, sort of. But we'll show you that in a minute. In 1966, President Johnson picked Waterloo, New York as the birthplace in May 5th, 1866. And it's a presidential proclamation. It's not a law. So I guess maybe the others are still in the running. And we'll see what happens. Because here's another contender. I call it Forgotten Memorial Day in Charleston, South Carolina on May 1st, 1865. They had Union prisoners of war were held at the Hampton Park Racecourse outside of the city, and at least 257 died and were buried there. And when the Confederates left, they didn't bring the prisoners with them. They just left everyone there. And so the Black community, African-American community, they actually organized a ceremony. They reburied the dead. They memorialized them. It was actually covered by several newspapers. And so they are a very strong contender for the honor. Now, here's another piece of evidence. And this is a sheet music that was published in 1867 in New Orleans. And it's called Where Our Loves Are Sleeping. Now, it's dedicated to the ladies of the South who decorate the graves of the Confederate dead. And that's what they were still doing. So it was if you're going to publish sheet music and distribute it, this was going very far along by this point. And thanks to Mrs. L. Miller Sweet for writing it. Now, another date, May 30th, 1868, Arlington National Cemetery conducted a ceremony to observe Decoration Day. And that's what it was originally called. It wasn't until much, much later, I think President Nixon, I think he codified it, but it had already started changing before that. And so there's even a poem here on this page by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that was recited at that ceremony. And so that was a real big thing. And they further promoted it. This was a typical 19th century illustration of a Decoration Day observance, and it's filled with the Victorian sentiment of a widow and her little girl planting flowers on supposedly her father's grave, while these brave men in uniform are in behind and carrying the flag and everything. So it's, as they say in New York, had a lot of schmaltz. Now, another way to promote it, they promoted broadsides, flyers, newspapers, but here was a new piece of technology. This was actually a stereograph photography. And this is actually Scully Square in Boston. And it doesn't give a date, but it's sometime in the 19th century. So you didn't even actually, if you couldn't go to a parade, all you had to do was buy the slide and put in your stereopticon and look at it and see what you wanted to see your parade. Now, Memorial Day always seems to have much more special significance in a war. And this was taken by Life Magazine, and this shows people in Washington on Pennsylvania Avenue on May 30th, 1942, which was the first Memorial Day after Pearl Harbor. And they're not only enjoying the day, but in the parade, they had a really impressive amount of firepower, which I'm sure did a lot of good for morale. Excuse me. One thing that probably helped is the month before we had successfully conducted the Doolittle raid on Japan. 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. We actually have that book and they have a good movie based on that. So, I think wartime always sort of brings it closer to us that day. Now, there's a lot of ways to learn more. And this is from the Library of Congress. They actually have a picture division, and they showed all these different illustrations that had been produced and are in their collection about Decoration Day and Memorial Day. Now, of course, we have to say, what about women? Right now, there is no actual national memorial dedicated to women in war, and there have always been so. I mean, as early as the 1700s, General Washington asked for a general order for nurses to be recruited to be administered by a matron who would be responsible for the care of the sick and the wounded. And so they have, and some of them even served as soldiers. There was a woman in New York. It wasn't until she was wounded in the Battle of Fort Washington that they knew she was a woman, because she dressed as a man and probably cussed like one too, just to keep the illusion up. And she even got a pension out of it. And so, but they are covered. There's literally hundreds of memorials to women in war. And I've read that there is some plan afoot to have in Washington a monument dedicated to women in World War II nurses. And they're still working on that, but they're also by implication equally represented in the large memorials. Like for instance, you've probably seen the heroes' flights to see the World War II monuments in Washington, and people don't realize it, but there's a very, very impressive one in Kansas City dedicated to American personnel in the First World War. So if you ever get out that way, you should definitely take a look at it. Now, this is also an important thing. A lot of poems, a lot of sentimental things are published to blessings. They're all over the internet. These are really, really easy to find and to help educate people what they mean. Now, this is a rather unique memorial. It's American Civil War Memorial, but it's known as the Scottish American Soldiers Monument, and it was dedicated in 1893 to Scots, native-born Scots, who fought and died in our Civil War. And the picture, the statue is a statue of Abraham Lincoln with a freed slave, basically sort of honoring him. And of course, that kind of image is probably not in line with what a lot of people would like today, but that was a very 19th century thing to do. In my own hometown of Brooklyn, there's one very much like it, dedicated to Henry Ward Beecher, who was a staunch abolitionist, and he was also the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and he actually conducted mock slave auctions, and they were so popular before the Civil War that they called the Sunday morning ferries Beecher boats going from New York to Brooklyn. And so there's a statue very much like that, shows two African Americans reaching up towards this high pedestal. So like I say, it's not the kind of image we like anymore, so it's very controversial. Now, there are signs of renewal, as I said before, because, social media, Facebook posts, Instagram posts, like this is a typical Facebook page. We have a National Memorial Day concert in Washington, which is always a lot of fun to actually, see, and they broadcast it on TV. So between everything on social media, people talking about it, I hope they keep this day alive because it's a very important day. And that is the end, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm open for questions. It's raining cats and dogs here, so I'm not going to dash out just yet. But if anything you want to talk about, please feel free.
Hi, Tom.
Yeah.
I was wondering what was wrong with the sound. It must be the rain.
It could be.
All right, so I wanted to go back to the slide that you showed that I thought was so interesting when we're trying to figure out, who started Memorial Day, why did it start? And you talked about the area where they left the newly freed slaves, just left them there.
Yeah.
And they ended up, can you explain that a little bit? So they ended up burying people.
Right, because you could say it was their way of saying thank you, because after all, they had no real reason to bury any Confederate dead because of the cause wanted to keep slavery. There are a lot of other reasons why the war was fought, but it was very important because once the Confederate Army left, they were essentially free.
It's interesting.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why Gone with the Wind is so controversial, because it doesn't give an accurate portrayal of African Americans in servitude, and so people thought differently in the 1930s, and we think differently now. It's the way it is.
Tom, I
Yeah.
know you know this, but Lone Oak Cemetery puts out lots of flags.
I've done
Memorial
it.
Day, and it's always very impressive to drive around in the
Mhm.
cemetery and just see all the flags.
Oh, yeah. Because like I said, I've done it a couple of times. It wasn't always easy because many times I was actually working the day they were doing it. But, now I have a much freer schedule. So, and Gloria Ann still emails me. So,
Me too. Me too, but I
yeah,
can't.
if I can make it, right. If I can make it,